hypertension, diabetes, obesity, high LDL cholesterol, inactivity, smoking.
It's basically a cardiovascular risk panel.
It's the same things that give you a heart attack. 20 years later, those same risk factors are what give you dementia. The headline you might have seen about lecanemab said that it slowed cognitive decline by 27%, and for the counterpart, donanemab, by about 35%. And people hear that and think reasonably great, like that's a decline in a third less or 25% less. That's huge. But the brain you have at 85 is being built or eroded by the choices you're making at 50.
Welcome to MD Longevity Lab, where we're playing the long game. This is a podcast where science meets real life with expert insights, practical tips, and real-world tools to not only live longer, but live better. Our aim is to radically change the way medicine is practiced and enable individuals to age gracefully, maintaining health span and vitality well into their later years. We're your hosts, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Vikas Patel, physicians, partners in life, and parents balancing work, wellness, and everything in between. Let's dive in.
Okay, here's a statistic that's pretty uncomfortable. If you live into your mid-80s, your odds of developing dementia are somewhere around 1 in 3. Like not a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, literally 1 in 3. And yet most of us spend literally 0 minutes in our 40s or 50s thinking about that because it feels like something that happens to you later, kind of out of the blue. Today, we're going to make the case that that's almost entirely wrong.
Yeah, that statistic 1 in 3. And, I've made my peace with a lot of the aging process over the years now that I'm in my mid-40s. Wrinkles, fine. Gravity in my body parts, fine. Reading glasses as of 2 years ago, fine. But this dementia part, this one's actually not something I'm willing to negotiate with the universe about. And I've already told you, Vikas, you've heard this 100 times. If I'm in a diaper or I can't remember your name or our kids' names, that's when we call it a day. You need to pull the plug.
Yes, you have said this to me many times, and I reassure you every time that with your near elite VO2 max and all your big booty muscle gains, she's been working on it, guys.
Yeah, I have.
You're probably still going to remember like 40 years from now that one time I didn't take out the trash. It was only once.
Only once, yeah. You've only had a transgression once in this entire marriage. I think I'm already getting dementia. I don't know if that was a compliment or a dig, but thank you for noticing my big booty gains. I did squats and deadlifts today. Thanks for noticing. But this is the whole reason we're actually doing this episode. A huge fraction of dementia is preventable, or at the very least delayable. We have much better evidence for that today than we've ever had previously, and that should make this a hopeful episode rather than a scary one.
That's right. Welcome to the MD Longevity Lab podcast, where we're playing the long game. I'm Dr. Vikas Patel.
And I'm Dr. Nisha Patel. Today's topic is dementia. We are going to hit the biggest risk factors. We're going to spend some real time on APOE genetics, that one-time test. That's the gene that everybody's getting tested for now, and half the time they're misunderstanding what it actually means. We're going to talk specifically about women and the brain, which is a story that's been undertold, and we'll close with the new FDA-approved medications for dementia and why, honestly, they've been kind of a letdown, to say the least.
Shout out to one of my friends from the Navy who actually requested we cover this topic.
Yes. So this was a requested topic,
yes,
and specifically to cover women in dementia as well.
Correct.
So we're going to be doing a lot of that.
All right. So let's get into this. Let's first define a few terms here because people use dementia and Alzheimer's pretty much interchangeably, and they're not really the same thing. Dementia is this umbrella term. It is a syndrome, the clinical picture of cognitive decline severe enough to interfere with daily life. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause under that umbrella. Somewhere around 60 to 70% of cases of dementia are actually from Alzheimer's, but there's also vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and very often, almost in most patients, it's a mixed pathology, meaning that it's not just one of these causes of dementia. It's typically one may be predominant, but it's a mixture of several of them that the patient is actually experiencing.
Yeah, and that mixed point really matters more than people realize because that public conversation is almost entirely about the amyloid plaques and Alzheimer's. But a lot of what robs people of their minds in that dementia process in their 80s is actually vascular. It's those small blood vessels in the brain that start getting damaged the same way your blood vessels in your heart start getting damaged as well. Which, if you've listened to the show, you know that's Vikas's answer to literally everything, right? Headache, probably microvascular. Bad knee, vascular. I've stopped asking.
Right. So this is the through line of basically everything we talk about. The brain is a highly vascular organ. It's metabolically the most demanding tissue in the body. It's literally only 2% of our body weight, yet it consumes 20% of our energy.
Yeah, so it's the most expensive organ you own, and your brain is completely underinsured. Great. I love that for us.
So anything that wrecks the blood vessels or your metabolism is downstream a brain problem. Just hold that thought because it's something that we're going to come back to when we get into kind of the prevention.
All right. So why don't you rank some of the risk factors? What is driving all of this brain decline?
Let's start with the ones that you can't change, and then we'll move into the ones that you can change. So the single biggest risk factor by a long shot is one that you can't really do anything about, and that is age, right? So the risk of dementia roughly doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. So unfortunately, we're all getting older and we cannot mitigate the fact that we're getting older. Number two on the non-modifiable list is genetics. And the heavyweight here is that APOE gene, right? So this is something that we're going to get into a little bit later, that there's three subtypes of the APOE gene. There's a E2, E3, E4, and we'll get into the genetics and what those numbers or genes actually mean. Number three, which we'll also dedicate a segment to here, is our sex, right? So being female, women carry about 2/3 of the Alzheimer's burden. And that's not just because they live longer. We'll get into a little bit more about the difference in sex.
Yeah. So age, genetics, and gender. Those are the cards you're dealt. But here's where it gets pretty interesting. Let's get to the modifiable side. There was a huge report in the Lancet Commission on Dementia, which was updated in 2024, and they did the math on how much dementia is attributable to risk factors people can actually do something about. Their estimate, around 45% of dementia cases worldwide are potentially preventable by addressing 14 modifiable risk factors across the course of a lifetime. And that's awesome, right? We have these three unmodifiable risk factors that you mentioned in brain health, which is age, genetics, and gender. But there's 14 modifiable risk factors. When I read that, I was blown away. Like, we have way more control than we think.
Totally. Like nearly half the risk is something that we can actually control.
Mm-hmm.
And, on a population level, if everyone fixed everything, then really we would be able to eliminate dementia, not eliminate, but drastically reduce the incidence, at the very least be pushing it off another decade further than when we typically see it. So this is not purely like a lottery of bad genes or bad luck. A big chunk of this really tracks with how we are living.
All right. So you touched on the three non-modifiable risk factors. So what are the 14 modifiable risk factors? Let's run through them because they cluster in a way that tells a story. In early life, it's lower levels of education, basically building cognitive reserve when you're young. In midlife, the big ones are hearing loss, high cholesterol, specifically LDL cholesterol that was newly added in the 2024 update, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, high blood pressure, obesity, and excessive alcohol. And then, so that's midlife. We talked about early life, midlife. So now in later life comes social isolation, air pollution, untreated vision loss. And that was the newest addition.
And look at that midlife cluster again, right? Hypertension, diabetes, obesity, high LDL cholesterol, inactivity, smoking. Nish, what does that sound like?
It's basically a cardiovascular risk panel and metabolic syndrome with a couple of freebies thrown in, right?
Totally. It's exactly that, the cardiometabolic risk profile. It's the same things that give you a heart attack. Just 20 years later, those same risk factors are what give you dementia. So this is why I keep telling patients, when you're managing your blood pressure or your glucose or your lipids in your 40s and 50s, you're not just protecting your heart, you're protecting your brain, you're protecting it during a window when it actually matters, which is really those decades prior to any symptoms showing up.
So let's flag two on that list that people sleep on because they're not exactly obvious. Hearing loss, number one, by the way, in terms of how much population risk it's estimated to carry in midlife. Untreated hearing loss is associated with meaningfully higher dementia risk. And the leading theories are some combination of cognitive load that your brain is straining constantly to decode this muddy sound. Plus, when you can't hear things, it results in social withdrawal and reduced stimulation. The practical takeaway is almost absurdly simple. Get your hearing checked. And if you need hearing aids, wear them. People resist it for vanity reasons, and it may be one of the highest leverage brain moves available to us.
Exactly. The second sleeper is social isolation. So loneliness is not just sad, it appears to actually be neurotoxic over time, which, by the way, kind of fits that evolutionary lens that I'm always banging on about. We are profoundly social primates. Our brains got bigger for social complexity. A brain with no people to track and no problems to solve is a brain that's being starved of the thing that it actually evolved to do.
Yeah, that's a nice segue into the bigger framing because the thread under all of this, right? Genes, metabolism, vasculature, social life, it's your evolutionary mismatch that you talk about. Our biology was tuned for a world of constant movement, real food, deep sleep, tight social bonds, and we've basically engineered all of that out of our modern life now. Dementia, in a lot of cases, is what an ancient brain looks like after 50 years of a mismatched environment.
And I think this is also weirdly kind of the hopeful part, right? Because mismatch is something that we can partially correct. While you can't change that genome component, you can actually change the inputs that we're giving our body. So let's go deeper now into that gene that we were referencing. APOE, which is apolipoprotein E. We get asked about this constantly now, partly because consumer genetic tests are available and reported, partly because it shows up on a lot of these advanced longevity panels, including our own. So let's actually explain what it is before we talk about the risk.
Yep. APOE is a gene that codes for protein involved in moving and transporting lipids, fats, and cholesterol in your body, including the brain. And it comes from three common flavors. The variants are E2, E3, and E4. So you basically inherit one copy. Each one of us has two copies of these genes, and we inherit one copy from each parent. So you end up with a pair. The most common is E3, and that's neutral. That's basically average risk of dementia for the general population. That's the baseline version, most common. E2 is relatively protective against Alzheimer's, which is rare, and E4 is that high risk variant.
Yeah, so E4 is actually the most ancient form of this gene that our ancestors carried. Then the E3 became the more common variant, and actually the E2 is the newest version of that gene. So here's some of the rough population numbers in our population, because everyone really wants to know how common are these things. So about a quarter of people, roughly 25%, carry at least one copy of E4. And a much smaller slice, somewhere around 2 or 3% of people, carry two copies of E4. They are what we would call E4 homozygotes, E4. That distinction between one copy and two copies turns out to be enormous.
Yeah, if you carry one copy of E4, which is that higher risk for dementia, you're a heterozygote. If you remember, well, we remember back to genetics because this was ingrained in us, but everyone learned about Mendelian genetics in high school, presumably biology. And if you recall, being a homozygote is two of the same, hetero is one of each. So if you have that one copy of E4, you're a heterozygote. Your lifetime risk of Alzheimer's is roughly 2 to 3 times higher than someone with that E3 pair, that normal risk. But if you carry two copies of that E4, that high risk gene, that risk jumps dramatically. And estimates range from around 8 to 12 times higher risk of getting dementia. And some studies put it way higher than that, even still. So it's one of the strongest genetic risk factors we know of for that common late onset, even early onset form of the disease.
There was a study in 2024 in Nature Medicine that I think genuinely changed how we should be talking about this. A group looked at thousands of people with two copies of E4 and found some striking evidence here. So almost all of them showed Alzheimer's brain pathology starting from around the age of 55. By 65, nearly all of them had abnormal amyloid levels. And the age of symptom onset was earlier and, importantly, predictable, clustering right around age 65. The biomarker sequence unfolded in a very consistent order. So amyloid deposits, these are these plaques inside the brain that we know should be some of the hallmarks of developing Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, and the author's conclusion was pretty provocative. They argued that being E4 shouldn't really be thought of as a risk factor at all anymore. It behaves more like a genetically determined form of Alzheimer's, in the same category conceptually as the rare inherited early onset forms of Alzheimer's that develop in Down syndrome. And in medicine, we know that many of these Down's patients develop Alzheimer's early and near full penetrance, meaning if you live long enough with those two copies of E4, the biology is very likely to show up.
All right, so I want to be really careful here because this is exactly the kind of statement that can really land badly. If you're listening and you just got a test back that says E4, I do not want you to hear you are doomed. This is not at all what this actually means.
Oh yeah, it's so important. A few things first. First, penetrance of the pathology is not the same as the certainty or the timing of dementia. People who have that E4 still vary a lot in when and whether they even develop clinical symptoms. Second, this data is overwhelmingly from people of European descent, and APOE behaves very differently across ancestries. The risk picture is genuinely different in African, Hispanic, and East Asian populations, and the science there is still catching up. Third, and this is the most important, why don't you get into it?
Yeah, so genes, we've said this before, genes load the gun. Environment and behavior actually pull the trigger. And we'll show you in the prevention segment that the lifestyle interventions that work really work regardless of APOE status. That's not a hope, that's really just what the data shows.
Yeah. I mean, we got tested. Do you want to share our results?
I think we were
both
E3,
E3,
E3.
which is average risk. So us having normal genetics, E3, E3, we were relieved. We didn't have an E4 copy, but we are still at risk for dementia having normal genetics, right?
In your family, I think there has been some history of dementia in your family, correct?
Yes, but there's not E4.
Right. It's
Yeah.
from the other factors that
Yep.
we're going to cover.
The
right?
modifiable risk factors. So early dementia runs in my family, which is part of the reason. I mean, I'm so proactive because I saw my paternal grandma suffer from it at such an early age, and it was hard, I'm sure, on her, but her kids, us as the grandchildren. So it's definitely, I mean, any of you guys listening, if you have a family member, loved one, you know the pain. It's really a horrible disease. So if you've lived with someone or experienced this, there's no wonder why people are listening and wanting to know what they can do about this. So should people even get tested? That's a real question we navigate with patients, right?
Yeah, my honest answer here is it entirely depends on the person. There's a real argument for knowing. I think for us, it was important because for us, it kind of would have sharpened our motivation, changed how aggressively we would monitor, and I think as we'll discuss, it changes your risk profile if you ever are going to consider things like some of the newer drugs. But there's also this real argument against getting tested because right now there is no APOE specific treatment. So you can find out that you're high risk and have no medication that's truly targeted to treat that APOE. So from my standpoint, I think that the knowledge is very empowering because it allows us to dial down on the modifiable risk factors. And the evidence really shows that for the people who are APOE4 carriers, good habits, good clean lifestyle pay them back in higher dividends than the people who are E3 or E2. And that's just the way the science has been following that while bad habits are amplified by the E4 gene, good habits are also amplified by the E4 gene.
Yeah, we have a patient who's E4, surgeon, right? Parent, 3 kids. And for this particular patient, it was empowering getting that confirmation. And they had suspected because there was a strong family history of early dementia, but this just put the flame under that person's butt. Like, I have to get my VO2 max up, my lean muscle mass, prioritize sleep because, if they want to be around for their kids long enough to remember them, it really matters so much more for that patient.
Yeah, that person is quite dialed in now.
Yeah, totally. And there can be insurance and psychological implications as well. So this is genuinely a talk to someone before you get tested. Ideally with a physician who can spend time with you, not just spit in a tube on a whim decision and get some AI printout. Because here's the thing that nobody tells you before you order those fun genetic hits at 11 p.m. You can't unknow that result once you have it, once you get tested. You wanted to find your great grandmother's village, and now you are staring at 2 E4s in the middle of the night. So go in with your own eyes open with the test, ideally with a physician who is versed in explaining what the implications of having an E4 gene is and then what to do about it, not with a glass of wine and a shopping cart.
And this is exactly the right place, I think, to draw the bigger line here because it matters for how people use all the new testing that's out there.
Yeah, it really does. We're living through a boom in at-home made direct-to-consumer panels and apps that literally hand you your APOE status, your biomarkers, a color-coded dashboard, and an AI summary telling you what it all means.
And some of that technology is genuinely good, The problem isn't really the data. The problem is what happens after the data.
Right. A dashboard can tell you that you're E4, but a dashboard cannot sit across from you and help you decide whether you even wanted to know that information. It can't read in the context of your mother's family history, your cardiovascular profile, your metabolic numbers, your actual habits in your life. An algorithm just flags it and it doesn't counsel you on your personal plan.
I think this is why in our practice, we use the advanced testing, but it's a starting point. It's not really the end point. AI is fantastic at surfacing the signal, but then a physician who actually understands this stuff has to look at it with you and say, here's what we do about it. Here's what matters specifically with your lifestyle, and here's how we're going to manage this is how we're going to track it over time.
Yep. Because the failure mode we see constantly is somebody walks in completely terrified, holding a printout, having been told by an app that they're doomed and they're definitely getting dementia. And half the time, the actionable answer is the same brain healthy living we're about to spend the whole segment on. The test without a doctor just manufactures anxiety. The test with the right doctor turns into an action plan.
A number on the screen, I don't think is really care. And what you do about the number is really the caring part.
Yep. One more APOE point to bang for later, because it's going to matter twice in this episode.
The E4 gene doesn't just raise your risk of disease, it also raises your risk of side effects from the new amyloid drugs. So there's things like brain swelling and bleeding that we're going to talk to near the end of this podcast. And Nisha, I think this is your cue. It interacts very powerfully with being female.
It does, which is a perfect bridge. All right, so let's get into women specifically and the brain. This is the undertold story. So here's a fact that isn't common knowledge. Women make up about 2/3 of everyone living with Alzheimer's. 2 out of 3 Alzheimer's patients are women. And I want to sit in that injustice for just a second. We as women have been underrepresented in medical research for basically the entire history of medicine. We got left out of trials for decades because our hormones were too complicated. Heart attacks in women literally still get missed to this day because the textbook symptoms were written about men, right? That crushing substernal pain radiating to their arm. And then after all that, the one place we somehow end up overrepresented in is dementia statistics, literally understudied on the way in, overdiagnosed on the way out. I would like to speak with a manager.
Well, when you put it like that.
Genuinely, I want to speak with a manager. Who do I email? Who do I air my grievances to? For a long time, the official explanation was basically a shrug. Well, women live longer than men, and age is the biggest risk factor. Therefore, that's why women get dementia more frequently. End of story, right?
Yeah, and that explanation is partly true, but it's nowhere near complete. The age difference is not the whole answer.
Yeah, women do live around 4 to 5 years longer on average, and that contributes. But when you actually control for longevity, that gap doesn't actually disappear. The age standardized prevalence of dementia is still meaningfully higher in women. The female to male ratio is something like 1.7. So the female to male ratio is something like 1.7. So basically a 2-to-1 ratio. So longevity is part of it, but there's clearly something biological going on that's specific to the female brain. And the research community is finally taking that seriously.
So tell them about the APOE interaction, because this is the one that I think really is fascinating.
Yeah, this is the headline that is pretty fascinating. Researchers at Stanford documented over a decade ago that APOE4 gene, that high-risk gene that we just talked about in the previous segment, the risk gene does not carry the same risk for men and women. In their data, carrying the APOE4 gene raised dementia risk by about 81% for women, but only around 27% for men. So the same gene, wildly different impact depending on your gender. So when we say APOE4 is the biggest genetic risk factor, we should really be saying it's the biggest genetic risk factor, especially for women. And the effect seems particularly pronounced in women carrying even a single copy.
It's a pretty stunning number, and it reframes that really that entire genetics conversation. So what's the mechanism? Why would the same gene hit women so much differently than men?
The leading answer, and it's incredibly well supported, is estrogen, and specifically what happens to the brain at menopause. So let's spell out the logic because it's elegant and it's a little heartbreaking, frankly. Estrogen is not just a reproductive hormone. We know that. The brain is full of estrogen receptors, and estrogen is deeply involved in how brain cells utilize energy. It supports glucose metabolism and mitochondrial function in neurons. Estrogen is, in a real sense, a master regulator of the brain's fuel system, and it's no surprise that a female hormone is the master regulator.
So you're saying that the brain runs partly on an estrogen-supported metabolic system.
Right. And then menopause walks in and shuts off the power like it's paying the electric bill. Estrogen drops off a cliff over a relatively short window, and the brain, which had been quietly running on it this whole time, has to scramble for a backup generator. And what researchers using brain imaging have found is that around that menopausal transition, the female brain undergoes a measurable metabolic shift, a drop in how efficiently it uses glucose, changes in energy metabolism. For most women, the brain adapts and compensates. But that hypothesis, and it's a pretty compelling one, is that for some women, particularly those with the APOE4 gene and other risk factors stacked up, the menopausal transition is the inflection point where Alzheimer's pathology starts to gain a foothold, decades before memory symptoms. And I can't tell you how many times we have patients that brain fog, right? Whether it's perimenopause or going through menopause, that transition, brain fog. I can't remember things. I feel like I'm not as sharp as I used to. It's like a dime a dozen now.
It's pretty common, pretty commonly documented that those are normal perimenopause and menopause symptoms. So basically what you're saying is the disease may actually begin biologically in midlife during perimenopause and menopause, even though it doesn't really announce itself clinically until, say, late 60s, 70s, 80s.
Absolutely. That's the model that's emerging. And it reframes menopause from a reproductive event that you get through into a genuine neurological and metabolic inflection point in a woman's life, which, as somebody who spends a lot of my clinical time and personal life in perimenopause and women's health, it's exactly the framing I wish more women got before they're actually in the thick of it.
Okay, so the follow-on question that would seem obvious is, does hormone therapy, right, HRT, estrogen replacement, prevent dementia?
And the honest, frustrating answer is #it's complicated, right? Like those Facebook relationships, like, are we dating? Are we married? #it's complicated. So it's complicated. And the data are genuinely mixed. It's very nuanced. The big trials from the early 2000s, the Women's Health Initiative actually raised alarm because in older women started years after menopause, certain HRT appeared to increase dementia risk, not decrease it. That set back the field literally an entire decade. And we now know that that WHI trial, literally, I mean, that I think for women's health was single-handedly the worst conducted study and set us back, 3 decades?
In some regards, there was some great stuff that came out of that, but there's some stuff that HRT in general was done differently back then.
They prescribed it to like 80-year-olds.
Yeah, the timing of it wasn't done correctly in the study, and the estrogens used aren't the same ones that we use now.
Yeah.
So that study is not good for this. So there's a big but here to what you're saying.
Other than mine in this room.
Pun intended.
There is a big but, and it's a timing hypothesis, sometimes called the critical window. The idea is that when you start HRT relative to menopause may matter enormously. Starting your estrogen early around that menopausal transition in the correct candidate may be protective or neutral for the brain. Whereas starting it many years later in a brain that's already accumulated a ton of plaque, pathology, vascular damage, that may be harmful. So that window of when we start HRT might help appear to be relatively early and relatively narrow.
And then what about the APOE interaction? That shows up here too, doesn't it?
It does. Some research suggests that the cognitive response to hormone therapy differs by APOE genotype.
Yeah, and the APOE interaction also shows up here, right? So there's some research that suggests the cognitive response to hormone therapy differs by APOE genotype, perhaps being more beneficial to APOE4 carriers, which is exactly what you'd expect if estrogen and this lipid handling gene are are tangled up in the same brain energy machinery. But I think we have to be pretty clear here with everyone listening. The evidence is not that strong and not consistent enough for anyone to be prescribing hormone therapy to prevent dementia. These are sub-analyses done in a few studies which point in that direction. That is not a guideline-supported use, period. This is an area of intense research right now. There are good reasons for many women to take hormone therapy, such as hot flashes, for sleep, for bone density, for quality of life, to reduce cardiovascular risk. And those are all legitimate conversations to have with your physician. But I'm taking it to prevent Alzheimer's, I think, is getting a little bit ahead of the science.
Yeah, and this is why we hate the supplement and hormone hype machine, because it takes a genuinely fascinating real signal, estrogen matters for the brain, and turns it into a product pitch, which basically has way more confidence than the data actually supports as of now.
I think the responsible version is women should know that menopause is a brain event, not just a reproductive one. They should be aggressive about the modifiable risk factors during exactly this window, midlife, because that may be when the brain is most vulnerable and most responsive. And they should have an individualized hormone therapy conversation based on what symptoms they have, their risk factors, and their timing, not based on a podcast, including this one.
Yep. And one more kind of sobering note here, and let's just pivot to what actually works. It's not just that women get Alzheimer's more often. There's evidence that once diagnosed, women may decline somewhat faster and carry a heavier pathological burden. So the stakes of getting ahead of it are way higher, which brings us to the best news of this whole episode. So we talked about all this gloom and doom. Let's get to the good news.
All right. So what actually works, right? We spent about a half hour on a pretty heavy topic here. So let's earn back some of that hope because the prevention story has gotten genuinely strong. And in the last couple of years, we've got the kind of evidence that we've really been waiting for.
Yeah, let's start with a study that I think is the most important thing to happen in this field recently. And it barely made mainstream news compared to the drugs. There was something called the US Pointer trial, and results came out in 2025, and it was published in JAMA. So why don't you go through that?
Yeah, this really matters because of what kind of study it is. So much of the prevention literature is observational. Basically, you're watching what happens to people. You notice that the ones who exercise might get less dementia, but you can't prove that exercise is what actually caused it, because maybe there's just healthy people just do more of everything healthy. The Pointer trial was actually a randomized control trial over 2,000 older adults, all at elevated risk for cognitive decline. They were randomly assigned to either a structured, supported lifestyle program or a self-guided version where they just got information and encouragement, but had to drive it all themselves. And the intervention wasn't some exotic drug, it was boring, right? It was the beautiful basics, just all bundled together. Regular physical exercise, a brain healthy diet, cognitive challenges, actually using your mind, social engagement, and monitoring of heart health numbers like blood pressure. It was multi-domain, pulling on all the levers at once. And the result, both groups actually improved their cognition over the 2 years, both of them. But the structured group, the more intensive group, improved more. They essentially protected their cognition against the normal age-related slide in a randomized trial with lifestyle. That's a headline I wish people were getting instead of the drug headlines.
And here's a part that ties this whole episode together. The benefit in that trial held up across APOE4 status. So the people carrying the risk gene benefited as well. So when we said earlier, the gene loads the gun and your behavior pulls the trigger, this is the data behind that statement. Your genotype, your genetics does not exempt you from the upside of doing the work. How many times do we hear from patients like, oh, I have a family history of this. It runs in my family. It's in my genetics. Your genes are not your destiny. And the second you kind of say that, like, I'm doomed to get this because this has happened in my family, you've already made up your mind.
You've made a concession.
Yep.
Yeah. So the Pointer trial actually built on an earlier Finnish trial called the Finger trial from about a decade earlier. That showed basically the same exact thing in a European population. So now we have it on 2 different continents. This is real. It's a replicated finding. And that's what's crazy. The Pointer trial only lasted 2 years. And in patients around the age of 68, the fact that they showed a difference in outcomes from just 2 years of structured intervention tells you that 1 or 2 decades of structured intervention would have a huge long-term impact if just 2 years of structured intervention can make a difference.
So now I hope you guys, you listeners, are starting to get the point that we keep hammering home, that brain health starts in midlife. Like that trial started late 60s, right? Imagine if we just focused on our brain health starting 30s, 40s, 50s. What a world this would be, right? All right, so let's get practical. If someone's driving and wants the actual to-do list, what is it? Let's go through the modifiable levers that they can pull.
I will die on this hill. Number 1, exercise. My neighbors all see me running outside and they must think I'm crazy.
Well, you're crazy, but
yeah,
they think you're crazy just for running.
Probably. All right. We said it before. If exercise was a drug, right, it'd be a multi-$100 billion blockbuster. It improves blood flow to the brain. It improves insulin sensitivity. It triggers growth factors that literally support the birth and survival of neurons, neurogenesis. It improves mood and improves your sleep quality. And you want both kinds. You want aerobic work, and regular listeners know I'm obsessed with building an aerobic-based zone 2 work for all the people who pay attention to such things. Zone 2 gets that strong metabolic engine. And then also resistance training, because muscle is also metabolically protective, and there's a real link between muscle strength, muscle mass, and brain health as we age.
Yep. Number 2 modifiable lever that we can pull is sleep. This one people most want to negotiate away, right? And I know we're busy, but we really shouldn't. During deep sleep, the brain runs what essentially is a waste clearance cycle. It flushes out metabolic byproducts, waste, including amyloid proteins, which are implicated in Alzheimer's disease. So every time you say, I'll sleep when I'm dead, congratulations, you're literally pressing fast forward. 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and treat sleep apnea if you have it. If your partner snores, if you snore, untreated sleep apnea is real, and it's a very fixable brain disease.
I believe you got 8.5 hours sleep last night.
I get 8.5. That's like a low normal for me.
I think you're right.
I think you've told me before, I'm like a 7.5 to 9 hours. And then you were like, people who get too much sleep also get dementia or something. Is that true?
So actually, this has been studied, 6.4 to 7.6 hours is the actual ideal amount of sleep for most people. If you're getting less than that, there's problems. If you're getting more than that, there could be problems, especially if it's somehow related to a disease process. So increased sleep is associated with one, sleep apnea, two, depression, anxiety, and then a lot of medication side effects. So there are, and then things like hypothyroidism. So there's other metabolic stuff, but no, you're not outside of the norm by any stretch.
I love sleep.
I love sleep. I wish I could get more of it.
You can. You just need to use a weighted blanket, a fan.
I need to get off the
sound
ER
machine.
schedule.
Yeah,
That's
you
what I
definitely
need.
do.
All right, number 3. This is where the whole cardiometabolic cluster collapses into one instruction: protect your blood vessels and your metabolism. You have to keep your blood pressure controlled. Midlife hypertension is one of the most important modifiable risk factors. Keep your glucose and insulin levels in a healthy range. Type 2 diabetes substantially raises dementia risk to the point where many doctors call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Manage your LDL cholesterol and APOE. Remember that got formally added to the dementia risk list in 2024. Do not smoke. Keep alcohol intake modest, and preferably not right before you go to bed because it will mess up number 2, which was sleep, right? Every one of these is a brain intervention disguised as heart prevention.
All right. Number 4, feed your brain well. We're not going to do a whole diet episode here, but the pattern with the most support is that Mediterranean style way of eating. Lots of plants, fish, olive oil, nuts, minimal amount of ultra processed food and added sugar. There's a brain focused variant called the MIND diet that emphasizes leafy greens and berries specifically. That unifying principle is real food, low and refined junk that drives metabolic problems that we just talked about. And I think we did a whole episode on ultra processed foods earlier.
Yes. Number 5, cognitive and social engagement. Keep learning difficult things. Stay connected to other people. Remember, social isolation is on the modifiable risk list. This is the use it or lose it principle, and it is very real. The goal is genuine challenge and genuine connection, not like a brain training app that just makes you better at doing brain training apps.
Yeah, like how old was I? I don't know. I was in my late 30s when I picked up tennis again as like a social sport as well. I played in high school, and that's something I can see myself doing, I don't know, 80s and 90s. I mean, my tennis partner, Richard, he's 76 and he can move with the best of us.
Reading, learning new topics by reading, journaling, playing musical instruments, all dancing, all have high cognitive loads, and are all very, very beneficial from a dementia prevention strategy standpoint.
All right. Number 6, the sensory ones we flagged earlier, and the one that people genuinely forget. Get your hearing checked and treat hearing loss, and get your vision checked and corrected. Both are now on that updated modifiable list, and both are mundane and boring, but they're pretty high leverage.
If I had to compress this entire segment into one sentence, the things that make you healthy, vital, and a connected 6-year-old are, to a remarkable degree, the exact same things that protect your brain at 85.
Yep. And the timing point, especially for the women listening, the highest leverage window is midlife. So do not wait for brain symptoms to start. By the time your memory is truly failing, a lot of the relevant biology has been unfolding for 15 or 20 years.
I think this is a good place to segue into the slightly disappointing medication segment. The world always wants a pill, and finally we have some. Uh, let's talk about why they're a little bit underwhelming here. So, roughly after 2 decades of failure after failure after failure in the Alzheimer's drug development world, we now have a new class of medications that the FDA has actually approved on their merits. These are the anti-amyloid antibodies. The two names to know are lecanemab, brand name Leqembi, which was approved in 2023, and then the brand name which was approved in 2024.
And we should give credit where it's due because these are a scientific milestone. For the first time, we have some drugs that don't just treat the symptoms, they actually go after a piece of the underlying biology of dementia. So these are antibodies, and they're delivered by an IV infusion, and they clear amyloid plaque out of the brain, and they clear it dramatically. On the brain scans, the amyloid largely goes away. So it's proof that you can remove amyloid on a living human, and it actually works.
Right. The amyloid clearance is real, and it's honestly pretty impressive. The problem, and this is the rest of the story, is what happens to the patient, because removing the plaque, in theory, was supposed to translate into people holding on to their minds. And the clinical benefit is unfortunately pretty modest. I'd say, honestly, underwhelming. Let me give you the actual numbers because the way these get reported is a little bit misleading.
I know this is hard and this is why we go to school for 18,000 years, is to be able to sift through these clinical trials, because when a pharmaceutical company presents as data, it can be very misleading to the public. So you need a doctor who can genuinely sit down with you and sift through this information. And here's the numbers trap. Why don't you go through it?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is the difference between like relative improvements versus absolute improvements. So the headline that you might have seen about lecanemab said that it slowed cognitive decline by 27%, and for the counterpart, donanemab, by about 35%. And people hear that and think reasonably great, like, that's a decline in a third less or 25% less. That's huge, but that's a relative number, and relative numbers without the absolute context are really kind of how you mislead people. So here's the absolute version. The main trial measured people on a scale called the CDR sum of boxes. It runs from 0 to 18. Higher is worse. Over 18 months, the placebo group declined by about 1.66 points. The group declined by about 1.21 points. So the actual difference between taking the drug and not taking it over a year and a half was about 0.45 points on an 18-point scale.
And the catch is that researchers have an estimate for how big of a change on that scale a person or family can even notice. So the minimal clinically important difference, and that's around 1 full point. So the drug's benefit, which is 0.45, is below the threshold. So that literally means you would not even be able to tell.
Yeah, it's below the threshold of what's really clinically perceptible. So both groups still got worse. Everybody declined. The drug group just declined a little bit more slowly, and by an amount that might be too small for the patient or the family to even actually feel in daily life. That's a very different statement than slows decline by a third. Both are technically true. Only one is really honest about what it means to live with it. So to be fair, again, this is 18 months. So over a longer period, there will likely be more meaningful slowing.
Yeah, so let's translate that 27% that the drug company sells you forever and at home. You still get worse. Your family still watches your dementia get worse. You just get worse slightly more politely on a scale that only a neurologist can possibly see for about 30 grand a year, is it? That IV infusion?
It's quite expensive.
Yeah. You're getting an IV infusion every 2 weeks. The marketing department of that drug company really earned its bonus on that one. And I think that's where the forest through the trees concept comes. So much of brain health relies on prevention, right? We never want our patients to get to that point where they're even entertaining that medicine because, I mean, that's a Hail Mary.
Yeah. So then we also have the other side of the ledger, which is the risks of these medications, and those are not trivial.
Yeah. The big one is something called ARIA, not our daughter Aria, because that's with a Y. This is ARIA, amyloid related imaging abnormalities. In plain English, it basically means brain swelling and small brain bleeds, which are picked up by MRI. These are the side effects of those medicines. So a lot of cases are silent and only seen on the scan, but some of those brain bleeds and brain swelling are symptomatic. And this can manifest as headaches, confusion, and in rare cases, way worse symptoms. So symptomatic ARIA shows up in something like 3 to 6% of treated patients.
And full circle here with the genetics, the risk of ARIA is substantially higher in APOE4 carriers and highest of all in E4 homozygotes. So the exact people at the highest genetic risk for the disease are the ones and who are really the ones who are most desperate for treatment are also the ones most likely to be harmed by these drugs. There have been deaths reported in the trials and in post-marketing, particularly in patients on blood thinners. So this is a drug that requires genetic testing, repeated MRI monitoring, IV infusions every couple weeks, and really a pretty serious conversation.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the rest of the world looks at the same data and blinked. And that's the difference. European regulators were way more cautious than we were in the US. They restricted this medication's approval, largely steering it away from that high-risk E4 patient. And they initially rejected lecanemab outright on a benefit versus risk basis. So this isn't fringe skepticism. There were serious international regulators that weighed that same evidence and came out more conservatively than the FDA did.
And it's worth mentioning the cautionary tale that came right before these. The first drug in this lineage, which is a brand name Aduhelm, got a controversial accelerated approval in 2021 against the advice of the FDA's own advisory committee. And it was such a debacle that it was eventually pulled from the market entirely. So the field has a recent history of getting out over its skis on amyloid.
Yep. So how do we counsel patients on this? Because someone listening that as a parent who was just offered one of these, right? Well, for the midlifers that are not doing anything about their health and thinking like, well, there'll probably be a medication or something to fix me. Don't hold your breath. But for those of you that have parents who have active dementia and who may be offered these medications, what would you counsel them? How would you counsel them?
Honestly and individually, these drugs are only for people in the early stages, which means they have a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia with confirmed amyloid. They do nothing for moderate or advanced dementia. And for the right early patient who understands that the benefit is real but small and probably not something they'll subjectively feel, who's not on blood thinners and who's willing to do the infusions and the MRI monitoring, I think it can be a reasonable, eyes open choice. It's buying time, even a little, can be very meaningful to a lot of families. But anyone selling this as a cure or even as a clearly life-changing treatment, I think is really overselling it. There are even neurologists giving it to E4 homozygotes, but this is relatively rare and there is a whole lot of monitoring. These neurologists are on the cutting edge and they have very particular profiles that they're looking for in these study patients.
Now, and here's a big picture takeaway. We spent 20 years and tens of billions of dollars betting almost everything on clearing amyloid. We can clear it beautifully, and the clinical payoff is modest. And that tells us amyloid is probably part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The disease of dementia, cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, it's way more complex than that, more multifactorial, and frankly, way more upstream than a single target drug model that targets amyloid.
I think that's kind of the entire philosophy of our show, right? The most powerful intervention we have for the brain is not the drug in the end. It's the way you live across decades before any of these symptoms start. The drug, even at its best, is trying to bail water out of a boat that's got holes in it. Prevention is not punching that hole in the first place.
Yep. All right. Quick recap for this dementia episode. The biggest risk factors. All right. Quick recap for this episode. The biggest non-modifiable risk factors, the risk factors we cannot change, are age, your genetics, specifically the AP status, and being a female. Those are the ones you can't change. But let's go through the risk factors, which are 45%, that make up 45% that you are modifiable.
The biggest risk factors, age, genetics, especially that APOE4 status, and being female. Those are the things that we can't change. But around 45% of dementia risk at the population level traces the things that you can change. And most of them are the same cardiometabolic lifestyle factors that we talk about every week. On APOE, one copy of E4 roughly doubles or triples your risk for dementia. Two copies is a different magnitude entirely, and it's almost 8 to 12 times the risk. But it's not a death sentence. The data are mostly in European descent populations, and the lifestyle interventions work regardless of your genotype.
Yeah, and on women, 2/3 of Alzheimer's is in women. It's not just longevity. The APOE4 gene hits women far harder than it hits men. And the menopausal transition appears to be a real brain inflection point in addition to a kick in the pants. Midlife is that window, and hormone therapy is legitimate, individualized, and it's a conversation for your doctor, not just over symptoms, but also quality of life. It's not yet a true proven dementia prevention strategy, but don't let anyone tell you otherwise. This is kind of what the data is leading to. So,
on the prevention side, we now have randomized trial evidence. The US Pointer trial, which is building on the Finger trial from Europe, that bundled lifestyle program, that a bundled lifestyle program protects cognition, even in E4 gene carriers. Exercise, sleep, metabolic and vascular health, eating real whole foods, mental and social engagement, and treating your hearing and vision. None of that's really exotic. All of that is under our control. And the earlier you start, the more it's worth.
And on the drugs, a genuine scientific milestone, but a genuinely disappointing clinical payoff. These drugs, they clear amyloid impressively and slow decline by an amount that's probably too small to feel, with real risks that fall hardest on those highest risk patients. They're not a reason to take your foot off the prevention pedal. If anything, they're the best argument for prevention that we've got. Like, don't hold your breath for these medications that are in the pipeline, because they're not that consequential, and the majority of what you can do is prevention.
The brain you have at 85 is being built or eroded by the choices you're making at 50. I don't think that's scary. That's kind of empowering from my standpoint. It's just, we have to take action.
As always, nothing is in this episode is medical advice for your specific situation. Talk to your own physician, especially on the genetic testing, HRT, and some medication decisions, because those are deeply individualized. And hey, best case, we do all of this. And the diaper conversation, Vikas and I keep having, stays hypothetical for a decent time.
A good long while. That's the goal. If this was useful, please share it with somebody. in their 40s or 50s who thinks they're too young to think about this, they're exactly the type of person who should hear it. Thanks again for joining us for another edition of the MD Longevity Lab podcast, where we are playing the long game.
Follow us on Substack, social media.
Leave us a review.
Yeah, a good one, hopefully.
And please send in your questions.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Take care, guys.
Thank you for playing the long game with MD Longevity Lab. You can visit us at www.mdlongevitylab.com to learn more about how we can support you on your journey. Stay connected with us on social media at MD Longevity Lab for tips, updates, and behind-the-scenes insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you subscribed, left us a rating, or shared it with someone you know who's also playing the long game. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.